Good morning, Push. Welcome back to our exciting video series. The Cold War continues. Today should be kind of quick. We'll pick up with the election after we described the Southern strategy last video. And Watergate, we'll run through quickly as ATF covered that in detail. A few other items to hit. We're out of here for this chapter. There'll be a note sheet updated note sheet, so please reference. Write down your questions. We're going to review on Friday on Google Classroom to go over any content questions we have before our testing for this section on Monday, Tuesday. So let's pick up here in the Republican, with the Republican nomination of their sitting president, Richard Nixon. In 72, his foreign policy success set the stage for a successful campaign, as we're going to see. George Wallace was in this election. We don't see him here, but he presented some real competition and challenge to that Southern strategy for Nixon throughout the Deep South, like stealing votes against that Southern strategy. This is the same Wallace, the populist segregationist, the hateful George Wallace. Unfortunately, perhaps fortunately, you see in the top left there, that's Arthur Bremer, 21-year-old, who walked up to Wallace and shot him on May 15th, 1972 in Maryland. Bremer, just eager for notoriety, he admitted in his diary later it's going to either be Nixon or Wallace in a statement of his manhood for the world to see. He got to Wallace, who was paralyzed, out of the race, paralyzed for life. No more threat to Nixon. Wallace will die in 1998. But with that, with Wallace out of the way for Nixon, it's just a Democratic candidate, Senator George McGovern from South Dakota, an anti-war liberal. Nixon was pleased when the Democrats chose McGovern, who was just complaining of dirty tricks by Nixon and the Nixon campaign. Over the course of the season, he just sounded like a sore loser and a whiner. There was no direct evidence to prove anything, as we know, until later on. Nixon at this juncture was pretty open, saying no one cares when somebody bugs somebody else. Of course, he had bugged his political opponents. He'd ordered a break-in at Brookings at this point. He tried to get IRS to intimidate Democrats. But during the campaign, it played very well for Nixon, as you can see there from that map, as McGovern just looked like a bellyacre. So this is the greatest landslide Republican victory up to that point. The second greatest ever. Ronald Reagan will surpass this in 1984 with 97.5% compared to Nixon's 96.6% here. It's second to only LBJ's defeat of Goldwater in 64 as the greatest landslide popular vote victory. And even that loss to Massachusetts here by Nixon in 72, Massachusetts, a Democratic state, a solid Democratic state since 28, he only lost that state by 8.97%. So that was close. It could have been a completely red map there for Nixon in 72. So the Democrats, however, retained control of Congress and will use that control to pressure the president here with the Watergate break-in. So I'm going to presume we are good with the Watergate story and scenario. There's evidence or examples on that sheet of CREEP, the Committee to Re-elect the President, caught on June 17th, 72. 6 burglars breaking into the Democratic headquarters in this building here in D.C. Former CIA agents involved, one of them working on the Nixon campaign. So many, remember, on his list were investigated by the IRS and other agencies, FBI, CIA, because they opposed Nixon in his long political career. And they were on his list. So this proves that Nixon would lie, cheat, commit crimes, even if it was for national security, even if it was for his own personal gain, this break-in. And this is all underscored by something we didn't mention. I don't think ATF touched on this, that the vicious partisanship of the 1960s, the Democratic Republican strain and arguing between each other. That's what we mean by partisanship. That just fed Nixon's paranoia and made it even worse, which will lead to an expansion of the credibility gap, of course, as we get through Watergate here, and McGovern's message being proven true. So as we get through the Watergate story, remember, CREEP included those plumbers to fix the leaks that were getting out into the media. They had broken into Ellsberg's psychiatrist's office to find files to try and bring him down and discredit the guy who leaked the Pentagon Papers, as we said. No solid proof that Nixon ordered these illegal activities early on. After months of the Irvine Committee investigations, it becomes clear he did try and cover up the information to avoid scandal, and there's some evidence on those tapes now that he did order certain things to take place, as you know. Those Irvine Committee hearings were televised, leading to an increased credibility gap. And we now know Watergate was just the tip of the iceberg for the dirty tricks of CREEP, making Grant and Harding scandals look like nothing in comparison. All told, 29 people were indicted, pled guilty and or were convicted of Watergate-related crimes. 43 total fined or went to jail. And along the way, during that issue, Nixon will face additional corruption issues. When Agnew, former governor of Maryland, Nixon vice president, was forced to resign in October of '73. As governor of Maryland, he took bribes and kickbacks as both governor and vice president, further expanding the credibility gap, that resignation of Agnew, which Congress will then invoke the 25th Amendment in 1967. Created in 67, saying that Congress can appoint a vice president when the office is open. So that was invoked for the resignation of Agnew and the appointment of Gerald Ford, a 12-term congressman from Michigan, very well respected, very well liked, personal, popular congressman. Becomes the only man ever in United States history to become vice president and president without receiving one vote. I think that's a fact of the day we've gone over before, but this gets us with the 25th, through most of our amendments. 22nd, we know 2 terms, 10 years. 23rd, District of Columbia. 24th, no poll tax. 25th, appoint a VP. 26th, voting age to 18. Some of us are approaching. And 27, congressional pay raises go into effect at the start of the next term. So after this, we will discuss briefly the Saturday Night Massacre, the firing of Archibald Cox there. That's the Harvard law professor that Nixon had referred to in colorful language in the reading. Nixon ordered him fired after he subpoenaed the tapes. Attorney General Elliot Richardson refused. He resigns in protest along with the Assistant Attorney General, the deputy. And in the end, the Solicitor General, Robert Bork, will fire Cox. That massacre led to an increased call on Congress and the public for impeachment, clearly an obstruction of justice. Nixon's approval rating drops to 17%. We see there John Dean on the left, a lawyer for the U.S., United States, and the Nixon administration. He testifies, as the reading described, accurately, calmly. And of course, this was to avoid jail time as a plea to he testified here. So the FBI will call him the master manipulator of the scandal. He said the tapes will reveal all. You'll see him on television now. The news brings him in as an expert on issues. He was on a lot during the impeachment trials. Seems ironic that he testified to avoid jail time for his crimes, and now we look to him for sage advice. But such is the United States. So with this pressure on Nixon, we're going to step away from this for a second, go over a few other developments internationally, and then get back to his resignation. So we see throughout this Watergate investigation, Congress legislate more restraint on presidents, and that War Powers Act there is a reversal. We're trying to rein in what Congress gave to Johnson with the Gulf of Tonkin. So this requires any president to report to Congress within 48 hours any military action. It also requires congressional approval, for any military action lasting more than 60 days. This was referenced recently with some conflicts in the Middle East in the news with regarding U.S. airstrikes. Also, on October 6, 73, Syria and Egypt, backed by the Soviet Union, attack Israel, seeking to recover land lost in that Six-Day War of 67 that we mentioned. That would turn into issues later on. Here it is. Nixon, following the doctrine, orders the nuclear forces ready, ordered $2 billion more in arms. Israel was able to hold their own. The war was over quickly without direct U.S. involvement. However, U.S. support came at a cost, and as a result, we see OPEC, the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, founded in 1960, we went over before, placed an embargo on oil to all Israeli supporters, the United States included. So this led to a worldwide oil shortage, long lines at the pump. It hurt the United States economy and United States public with a shortage in gasoline. And one of Kissinger's greatest successes, his supporters would say, was he was able to get that lifted in 1974 after tremendous pain here domestically. But really, as a result of the war and the resulting embargo, Kissinger embarked on his now famous shuttle diplomacy, flying to Moscow and all over the Middle East to negotiate a successful peace. Will set the stage for peace between Egypt and Israel in 1977 under President Carter, and that you can read about in later AMSCO chapters. Before back to Nixon's resignation, it's significant to note the 55-mile-an-hour speed limit was approved by Congress during the latter months of the Nixon administration. An oil pipeline in Alaska as a result of this embargo also approved. And then we get to the infamous August 9th, 74. After the Supreme Court case, U.S. v. Richard Nixon, forced him to reveal the tapes. The impeachment hearings that started under the House Judiciary Committee voted to recommend impeachment on 3 counts. That's obstruction, abuse of power, and contempt of Congress. And that was just further inflamed with the removal of those 18 minutes that you read about in ATF. So Ford will assume the presidency after this day, or on that day, takes over as the only unelected vice president and president in history. As we said, he declares our long nightmare is over. And we say goodbye to Nixon, tumultuous presidency, but let's look back to the beginning in 1969 when he assumed that office, hoping to heal America, bring order and stability, bring people back together after that terrible decade. In 1974, he left the country more deeply divided and wounded than when he assumed the presidency, some would argue. So with that, let's discuss the legacy of Watergate. Some success. This does show the strength of our political system and the success of checks and balances established by the founders. Also, of course, a loss in faith, credibility gap grows to a chasm after Watergate, and many continue to question the government. So with that credibility gap, remember we said most look to the Kennedy assassination for the beginning, the planting the seed of that gap, and this just expands that and solidifies that questioning of the government and their message. In actuality, of course, since FDR, as you know, every president had dangerously expanded the power of the presidency and the executive branch, and Congress sought to rein that power in as a result of Watergate, strengthening the Freedom of Information Act of 1966, which is also on the note sheet. So this required prompt responses to requests for information from government agencies and gave government agencies the burden of proof for classifying information, not the president, who can claim executive power, executive privilege, as Nixon liked to do. And some presidents afterwards, we'll see, also claim the same executive privilege in trying to do what they want unilaterally. So, with the first politically appointed chief executive here, we see a very honest, trustworthy, straightforward Ford. Everyone loved him in the beginning. He seemed to be a good fit. He was the average man kind of candidate, well liked. Unfortunately, much of his time was spent dealing with Watergate. Um, on September 8th, 1974, President Ford decided to grant a pardon, a full, free, and absolute pardon for um, President Nixon, declaring an end to our national nightmare. And many saw this as a corrupt bargain. Ford was questioned and pressured tremendously over this pardon. He steadfastly denied, claiming we had nothing to gain by putting Nixon in prison. The corrupt bargain, of course, is the belief that Nixon resigned so Ford could assume the presidency, and then Ford would pardon him later on. And we can connect across time if we look for a complex understanding point to the election of 1824, we might recall, with Quincy Adams, Clay, and Jackson being in a tie. Clay, Secretary of State, throws his support to Quincy, who then makes Clay Secretary of State. Clay is Speaker of the House, promised to support Quincy, who promised to and did appoint Clay as Secretary of State. More on that during review time, but it's a comparison, synthesis across history. On that day, the largest drop ever in United States history, Ford's approval rating went from 71%, exorbitantly high, to 49% as a result of this pardon, and probably ruined his reputation for re-election, which unfortunately we're not going to get to cover in too much detail. But this 895-day presidency is the shortest for any president who did not die in office. And we do have to give him some credit, though. We see the emergence of H.W. under Ford, who appointed him as director of the CIA to give a fresh look to that organization, to rebuild the morale and reputation after the fallout of Watergate. So H.W. at the federal level under President Ford. Vietnam will close out here, April of 1975. Unable to get more money, all support for Vietnam really lost. The U.S. supported Saigon fell to the communists in April of 75. This was the largest helicopter evacuation in history. It's all watched on TV in the United States and across the globe. It symbolizes a humiliating, embarrassing defeat to the United States. Saigon, capital of South Vietnam, will be renamed Ho Chi Minh City. Vietnam becomes communist. Vietnam is still communist. It runs on a free market rather than a Marxist ideology, but the world did not collapse. The sky did not fall when Vietnam became communist. Some would point to neighboring Cambodia and the emergence of the Khmer Rouge in 1968 under Pol Pot as evidence of that domino theory established by Eisenhower. But in reality, the rest of the region in Southeast Asia did not become communist. Pol Pot, however, one of the most ruthless human beings in history, a terrible genocide in Cambodia under his leadership in the 60s. In the end, 58,000 Americans dead, 300,000 wounded, 2,500 missing, and 100,000 plus return missing one or more limbs. And the plight of the veteran after Vietnam was like nothing seen in United States history prior to, where those veterans were not received the way previous veterans had been received by the public. 1976, the country celebrated its bicentennial. The pride in history helped Americans put the tumultuous 60s and the scandals of Watergate and Vietnam behind them and move on. Time to celebrate the nation and to look forward under new leadership down the road. So last thing to mention, I don't think we went into too much detail in it before, but the Immigration and Nationality Services Act, we said that Johnson did abolish the quotas of the 1920s. This was a famous historic piece of legislation signed on Liberty Island in New York, establishing hemispheric circles. So no quotas of the 1920s, hemispheric ceilings. 170,000 permitted from outside the Western Hemisphere, 120,000 from within, and 20,000 per country per year. So this opened up the immigration doors tremendously after being shut in the 1920s, well, 1920 and 24 with the Quota Acts. And so the 1960s will see our last group of new Americans with predominantly Asian immigration and Latin American immigration, symbolizing that last change. So with that, we'll sign off. Any questions? Please prepare those for Friday's lesson, and we'll see everyone then.